Some animals come into our lives carrying more than just scars from their past. When Buddy, a gentle golden retriever, was brought to Dr. Elise Warren's clinic with strange lumps on his neck, she thought it would be another routine surgery. She had treated countless rescue dogs over the years, each with their own story of abandonment and hope. But when the first lump burst open, what spilled onto her table was an infection. Tiny wax-sealed capsules scattered across the surgical cloth, each one holding pieces of a mystery that had been hidden for decades. Inside were coordinates, fragments of old photographs, and the wedding ring that belonged to someone who had vanished long ago. As more capsules emerged from Buddy's other lumps, Elise realized this wasn't just about helping a dog heal. What kind of person would use an innocent animal to hide such secrets? And why did this mystery seem connected to her own family's buried past? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Asterisk. Dr. Elise Warren had always found comfort in the predictable rhythms of veterinary medicine. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of her clinic, casting gentle shadows across the examination room where she'd spent the last 8 years of her life. At 34, she had built something solid here in Millbrook, a quiet lakeside town where the biggest excitement usually involved Mrs. Henderson's cat getting stuck in another tree, or the annual debate about whether the town dock needed repainting. The clinic itself reflected her personality clean lines, everything in its proper place, with touches of warmth that spoke to her genuine love for the animals she treated. Framed photographs of successful recoveries lined the walls, and a small shelf held thank you cards from grateful pet owners. Her veterinary journal sat open on the counter, filled with meticulous notes written in her careful handwriting. Each entry detailed not just medical observations, but thoughtful reflections on her patient's progress and the bond between animals and their humans. "Morning, Doc," called Sarah, her veterinary technician, as she unlocked the front door. Sarah Martinez had been with the practice for 3 years, a local girl who'd returned from veterinary school with dreams of helping animals in her hometown. She brought an energy to the clinic that Elise appreciated, though she sometimes worried that Sarah saw through her carefully constructed facade of contentment. "Good morning, Sarah. How's your mother's hip?" Elise asked, already reviewing the day's appointments in her journal. This was their routine gentle check-ins about family, discussion of the day ahead, the comfortable rhythm of two professionals who respected each other's work. "Much better. Thanks for asking. She's been doing those exercises you recommended." Sarah began preparing the treatment rooms, her movements efficient and practiced. "We've got a full day today. The Petersons are bringing in their new puppy for vaccinations, and there's that follow-up on the collie with the skin condition." Elise nodded, but her attention drifted to the window overlooking the lake. The water sparkled in the morning light, and she could see a few early fishermen casting their lines from small boats. This view had been one of the reasons she'd chosen Millbrook, the peaceful expanse of water that seemed to wash away the complications of the world beyond its shores. She'd come here 8 years ago, fresh from her residency, with little more than her veterinary degree and a desperate need to disappear from her past. The townspeople had welcomed her with the cautious warmth typical of small communities, and over time, she'd earned their trust through her skill and dedication. They didn't ask too many questions about why a promising young veterinarian would choose their small town over a lucrative practice in the city, and she was grateful for their discretion. The truth was complicated, as truth often is for those who flee from family secrets. Elise's mother had died when she was 22, leaving behind more questions than answers about her mysterious past. There had been unexplained phone calls in foreign languages, visitors who never stayed long, and a general sense that her mother was always looking over her shoulder, waiting for something that never came. After the funeral, when Elise had tried to piece together her mother's history, She'd found nothing but false starts and dead ends. It was as if Elise Warren had appeared fully formed when Elise was born, with no past worth documenting. Rather than continue digging into mysteries that seemed designed to stay buried, Elise had chosen escape. She'd completed her veterinary training with single-minded focus, using her studies as a shield against questions she wasn't ready to face. When the opportunity arose to take over Dr. Morrison's practice in Millbrook, she'd seized it like a lifeline. The morning passed in familiar patterns. Mrs. Chun brought in her elderly beagle for a checkup, and Elise spent extra time explaining the dog's arthritis medication. Knowing that Mrs. Chun lived alone and found comfort in these conversations about her beloved companion. Young Tommy Rodriguez arrived with his rabbit, Snowball, who had been acting lethargic. Elise's examination revealed a simple case of overgrown teeth, easily treated. Much to Tommy's relief, these were the moments that reminded her why she'd chosen this profession. Animals didn't lie or keep secrets. They presented their ailments honestly, trusted her to help them, and responded to treatment with genuine gratitude. There was a purity to veterinary medicine that human relationships rarely offered. Around noon, Harold Wickham arrived with Buddy. Elise had seen Harold around town, a man in his early 70s, who spent most of his time volunteering at the animal rescue shelter on the outskirts of town. He had the weathered hands of someone who'd worked outdoors for decades and the gentle manner that came from years of caring for abandoned animals. "Doc Warren, I hope you can fit this boy in," Harold sighed, his voice carrying a slight tremor that spoke of genuine concern. "Found him wandering near the old Morrison property 3 days ago. Nobody's claimed him, and he's got these odd lumps on his neck that have me worried." Elise looked down at Buddy, and her heart immediately went out to the golden retriever. He was perhaps 6 years old, with a coat that had seen better days, and eyes that held the particular sadness of an animal who'd been let down by humans before. But there was intelligence there too, and a willingness to trust, despite whatever hardships he'd endured. "Let's take a look at him," she said, kneeling down to let Buddy sniff her hand. The dog's tail wagged tentatively, and she felt the familiar tug of connection that drew her to rescue animals. They understood each other, she and these cast-off creatures. They recognized the need to build new lives from whatever pieces remained. Sarah helped lift Buddy onto the examination table, speaking to him in the soothing tones that came naturally to those who worked with frightened animals. Elise began her examination, running her hands along his body to assess his overall condition. He was underweight but not malnourished, suggesting he'd been on his own for weeks rather than months. When her fingers found the lumps Harold had mentioned, she paused. They were unusual, symmetrical, firm, and positioned in a way that didn't match any typical growth pattern she'd encountered in her years of practice. There were 4 of them, each about the size of a walnut, arranged in pairs on either side of his neck. "How long do you think he's been on his own?" she asked Harold, continuing her examination. "Hard to say. His coat suggests a few weeks, maybe a month. But here's the strange thing." Harold scratched his chin thoughtfully. "I've been working with rescue dogs for 15 years, and I've never seen lumps quite like these. They're too symmetrical to be natural growths, too well healed to be recent injuries." Elise made notes in her journal, sketching the position and approximate size of each lump. Her training told her they could be cysts, lipomas, or possibly infected lymph nodes. But Harold was right. Something about their placement seemed almost deliberate. "I'd like to do some x-rays and possibly a surgical exploration," she said. "These could be benign, but their positioning is unusual enough that I want to be thorough." Harold nodded, his weathered face showing relief that someone was taking Buddy's condition seriously. "Whatever he needs, Doc, I'll cover the costs. This boy's been through enough. He deserves proper care." As they scheduled the surgery for the following morning, Elise found herself looking forward to solving the puzzle of Buddy's condition. After years of routine treatments and predictable diagnoses, the mystery of the lumps intrigued her scientific mind. She had no way of knowing that her curiosity would soon unravel the carefully constructed piece she'd built in Millbrook. That evening, after the clinic closed, Elise sat in her small apartment above the practice, reviewing Buddy's case notes. The apartment reflected her minimalist approach to life-comfortable furniture. A small kitchen where she prepared simple meals, and bookshelves lined with veterinary texts and a few novels she read to unwind. There were no family photographs, no mementos from her past, only the present she built for herself. She found herself sketching the lumps again, trying to understand their unusual placement. Something about them nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite articulate. It was as if they were trying to tell her something, though such thoughts seemed foolish for a woman trained in the concrete realities of medical science. Outside her window, the lake reflected the last light of day, and she watched a few late boats returning to shore. Tomorrow she would perform what should be routine surgery on a rescue dog, and then life would return to its comfortable patterns. She had no reason to suspect that Buddy's lumps would prove to be anything more than a medical curiosity. But as she prepared for bed, Elise couldn't shake the feeling that Harold was right. There was something different about this case, something that would prove to be more than the sum of its medical parts. She told herself it was simply professional curiosity, the natural interest of a veterinarian faced with an unusual presentation. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow's surgery would crack open not just Buddy's mysterious lumps, but the carefully sealed compartments of her own past, releasing secrets that had been waiting patiently for her to find them. The surgery began like any other. Elise had performed hundreds of similar procedures over the years. The familiar ritual of preparation calmed her nerves and focused her mind. Sarah had prepared the surgical suite with her usual efficiency, and Buddy lay peacefully under anesthesia, his golden coat freshly shaved around the surgical site. "Vitals are stable," Sarah reported, monitoring the anesthesia equipment. "He's a strong dog, good muscle tone, despite being underweight." Elise made her first incision with the practiced confidence that came from years of experience. The tissue parted cleanly under her scalpel, revealing the first lump nestled beneath Buddy's skin. But as she began to dissect around it, she noticed something unusual about its texture and composition. "Sarah, does this look normal to you?" she asked, using her forceps to isolate the growth. Unlike the typical lipoma or cyst she'd expected, this mass felt firm and seemed to have a distinct capsule around it. Sarah leaned closer, adjusting the surgical light for a better view. "It's more defined than usual. Almost like the lump burst, not with the messy explosion of infected tissue, but with a controlled release that suggested it had been designed to open under pressure." What spilled onto the surgical table wasn't pus or fluid, but something far more perplexing. Tiny wax-sealed capsules, each no larger than a pill, scattered across the sterile surgical cloth. "What in the world?" Sarah started, but Elise held up a hand for silence, her medical training taking over despite her shock. "Don't touch anything yet," she said, though her own hands were trembling slightly. "Let me get the other lumps first. Then we'll figure out what we're dealing with." With methodical precision that masked her growing amazement, Elise removed the remaining 3 lumps. Each one contained similar capsules, though the contents seemed to vary. As she completed the surgical closure on Buddy's neck, her mind raced with possibilities, none of which made any medical sense. "Keep him under for a few more minutes," she told Sarah. "I want to examine these before he wakes up." Using sterile instruments, Elise carefully opened the first capsule. Inside was a piece of brittle paper, folded small and covered with numbers written in fading ink. The handwriting was precise, almost mechanical, and the numbers appeared to be coordinates, longitude and latitude, markers that could pinpoint a specific location. The second capsule yielded a fragment of a black and white photograph, torn along one edge as if it had been hastily divided. The image showed part of a woman's face, the features partially obscured by age and the limitations of old film development. But something about the visible portion, the curve of the cheek, the set of the jaw sent a chill through Elise's chest. "Dr. Warren?" Sarah's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Should I call someone? The police, maybe?" Elise looked up, realizing she'd been staring at the photograph fragment for several minutes. "Not yet. Let me see what else is here first." The third capsule contained what appeared to be an antique wedding ring, a simple gold band with an inscription that had worn nearly smooth with age. She could just make out the initials, Mankay, and what looked like a date from the 1960s. The final capsule held the most unsettling discovery: a bullet casing, tarnished with age but still clearly identifiable as .38 caliber. Unlike the other items, which seemed like mementos or information, this suggested violence, danger, something that had gone very wrong decades ago. "Dr. Warren, Buddy's starting to come around," Sarah said softly. Elise quickly gathered the items and placed them in a sterile container, her mind struggling to process what they'd discovered. A rescue dog carrying hidden artifacts in his body. It sounded like something from a thriller novel, not real life in quiet Millbrook. Buddy's recovery was normal, his vital signs strong as he emerged from anesthesia. Within an hour, he was alert and responding well to post-surgical care. But as Elise watched him, she couldn't help wondering about his story. Who had done this to him? When? And why? "I need to call Harold," she said finally. "He needs to know what we found." Harold arrived. Within 20 minutes, his face creased with worry. "How's the boy doing? Surgery go well?" "Buddy's fine," Elise assured him. "But Harold, you need to see what was inside those lumps." She led him to her office and carefully displayed the artifacts on her desk. Harold's reaction was immediate and telling. His face paled, and his hands began to shake as he leaned forward to examine the items more closely. "Dear God," he whispered, "I haven't seen anything like this in 40 years. "What do you mean?" Elise asked, her pulse quickening at his response. Harold picked up the coordinates with careful fingers, his eyes scanning the numbers with a familiarity that surprised her. "These are map coordinates, probably for somewhere around the lake. During the Cold War, this area." He stopped abruptly, as if catching himself before revealing too much. "Harold, what aren't you telling me?" The elderly man sat heavily in her chair, suddenly looking every one of his 70-plus years. "Dr. Warren, I think you stumbled onto something that was meant to stay buried. This lake, this whole region, it wasn't always the peaceful place you know now." Elise felt a strange combination of excitement and dread building in her chest. "Tell me." In the 60s and 70s, these waterways were used for things that weren't exactly legal. Smuggling routes, safe houses, people moving things that couldn't go through normal channels. Harold's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "I was young then, working various jobs around the lake. You hear things, see things, learn not to ask too many questions." The photograph fragment lay between them on the desk, and Elise found her eyes drawn back to it repeatedly. Something about those visible features continued to disturb her, though. She couldn't articulate why. "What about the ring?" she asked. "The initials MK?" Harold studied the band carefully, holding it up to the light to better see the worn engraving. "Could be initials. The date looks like 1962, maybe 1963. There was a fellow went missing around that time, if I remember right. Polish name, I think. Kowalski, maybe. Missing how? Just vanished one day. Left his boat tied up at the marina, wallet and keys in his truck, but never came home. His wife waited for years, thinking he might come back." Harold's voice carried the weight of old sadness. "She died still waiting, far as I know." Elise picked up the bullet casing, turning it over in her palm. The metal was cold and somehow ominous, carrying implications she wasn't sure she wanted to explore. And this? That suggests somebody didn't want to be found, Harold said grimly. Or that they found something they weren't supposed to. As they sat in the growing darkness of her office, Elise felt the foundations of her quiet life beginning to shift. The mystery contained in Buddy's body wasn't just a medical curiosity. It was a window into a past that someone had taken great care to hide. Harold, where exactly did you find Buddy? Near the old Morrison property, like I said. But there's something else. He hesitated, clearly wrestling with how much to reveal. The property's been abandoned for years, but lately, I've noticed signs that someone's been poking around there. Fresh tire tracks, disturbed vegetation. Like somebody else has been looking for something. The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Someone else knew about whatever secret Buddy had been carrying. And now that the secret was out, Elise couldn't help but wonder if that someone might come looking for what they'd found. What do you think we should do? She asked. Harold was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of experience she was only beginning to understand. I think, Dr. Warren, that you've opened a door that's been locked for a very long time, and I'm not sure any of us are prepared for what might come walking through it. The following evening, Harold returned to the clinic carrying a manila folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings and a magnifying glass that had seen better days. Elise had spent the day trying to focus on her regular patients, but her mind kept drifting to the mysterious artifacts now secured in her office safe. I did some digging, Harold said without preamble, settling into the chair across from her desk. Called in some favors with folks who've been around the lake longer than I have. Elise poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she'd kept warm, grateful for Harold's willingness to help unravel the mystery. There was something comforting about his presence, a steadiness that came from years of weathering life's storms. What did you find? Harold opened the folder and spread several newspaper clippings across her desk. The headlines were faded, but still legible. Local man vanishes from boat launch. Search continues for missing Millbrook resident. And wife appeals for information in husband's disappearance. Michael Kowalski, Harold said, pointing to a grainy photograph accompanying one of the articles. Age 34 when he disappeared in September 1963. Worked as a translator for various government agencies, though the articles are vague about exactly what kind of work. Elise studied the photograph, noting the intelligent eyes and serious expression of a man who looked like he carried weighty responsibilities. The timeline matched the date on the wedding ring they'd found. His wife was Elena Kowalski, 26 years old, Harold continued. According to the articles, she waited 2 years before having him declared legally dead. Then she seemed to disappear from public records entirely. The name stopped Elise cold. Elena? You know the name? My mother, Elise's voice caught in her throat. My mother's name was Elise Warren. But it has to be a coincidence. Harold's expression grew gentle but concerned. Dr. Warren, how much do you know about your mother's life before you were born? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Elise had spent years avoiding exactly this type of inquiry, content to accept her mother's vague explanations and obvious desire for privacy. But now, faced with tangible evidence of mysteries from the past, she found she couldn't dodge the uncomfortable truths any longer. Very little, she admitted. She was always evasive about her early life. Said the past was too painful to discuss. That starting fresh was better for both of us. Harold nodded knowingly. That's what people said when they needed to disappear. New name, new life. Hope nobody asks too many questions. From the folder, Harold withdrew the photograph fragment they'd found in Buddy's neck. Under the bright light of her desk lamp, he positioned it next to a newspaper photo of Elena Kowalski from one of the missing person articles. Elise's breath caught in her throat. the visible portion of the fragment, the curve of the cheek. The set of the jaw matched Elena Kowalski's features with unmistakable precision. The torn edge of the fragment suggested it had been part of a larger photograph, possibly a wedding picture or formal portrait. "This is impossible," Elise whispered. But even as she spoke, fragments of memory began surfacing. Her mother's occasional slip into what sounded like a European accent when she was tired or stressed. The way she always paid in cash and avoided official paperwork when possible. The complete absence of photographs or mementos from her life before Elise was born. "Tell me about your mother," Harold said gently. "What did she do for work?" Translation. Services. Freelance work for various clients. She spoke several languages: Russian, Polish, German. I always assumed she'd learned them in college. Elise paused, remembering. But she never talked about college. Never mentioned friends or family from before. Harold pulled out his magnifying glass and examined the photograph fragment more closely. The paper stock and development technique suggest this was taken in the early 1960s. Professional quality, not a family snapshot. As Elise stared at the evidence spread across her desk, a lifetime of half-answered questions began forming a clearer picture. Her mother's paranoia about strangers, her insistence on always having an escape plan, the way she taught Elise to be self-sufficient from an unusually young age. "Harold, if this is true, if my mother was Elena Kowalski, then what happened to her husband? To Michael? That's the question, isn't it?" Harold's voice carried the weight of someone who'd seen enough of life to know that answers were rarely simple or comfortable. A man disappears, leaving behind evidence hidden in a way that suggests he knew he was in danger. His wife disappears too, but she survives, changes her identity, builds a new life. Elise picked up the bullet casing, rolling it between her fingers, and someone ended up dead. Maybe. Or maybe someone wanted it to look that way. The implications were staggering. If her mother had been Elena Kowalski, then Elise's entire understanding of her family history was built on carefully constructed lies. More unsettling was the possibility that whatever had driven her parents into hiding might still pose a threat. "We need to find the location these coordinates point to," Elise said, surprised by her own decisiveness. If Michael Kowalski hid these things in Buddy, there might be more evidence wherever these numbers lead. Harold studied the coordinates. Again, his weathered finger tracing the numbers. "I can probably narrow it down to a general area. I've lived around this lake my whole life, know every cove and inlet. And if we find something, then we'll have to decide whether some secrets are better left buried," Harold said solemnly. "Your mother, Elena, she had reasons for disappearing. Good reasons, most likely. Digging into this could put you in danger." Elise looked out her office window at the peaceful lake, its surface reflecting the evening stars. For 8 years, she'd found safety in this quiet place, building a life that felt solid and predictable. But now she was being offered a chance to understand where she'd truly come from, to fill in the gaps that had haunted her since childhood. "I need to know," she said finally. "I spent my whole adult life running from questions I was afraid to ask. If there's even a chance that these artifacts can tell me who my parents really were, I have to follow where they lead." Harold nodded, though his expression remained troubled. "Then we'll need to be careful. If someone else has been searching the old Morrison property, they're probably looking for the same things we are, and they've had a lot longer to prepare for finding them." As they made plans to investigate the coordinates the following day, Elise felt a mixture of excitement and dread building in her chest. She was about to step away from the safe, predictable life she'd built and venture into territory that her mother had spent decades trying to escape. But as she looked at the photograph fragment one more time, seeing her mother's young face looking back at her across the decades, Elise knew she'd already made her choice. Some truths were worth the risk of discovery. The only question now was whether she was prepared for what those truths might reveal. The Millbrook Historical Society occupied a converted Victorian house on the town's main street, its rooms filled with dusty displays and filing cabinets that chronicled the area's past. Margaret Fleming, the Society's volunteer curator, was a woman in her 80s with sharp eyes and an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. Cold War activities around the lake? Margaret repeated, adjusting her glasses as she studied Harold and Elise across her cluttered desk. Well, that's not something we typically discuss in our official displays, but yes, there were certainly rumors. She led them to a back room where older records were stored, pulling out boxes that hadn't been opened in years. The lake was ideal for certain types of transportation that needed to avoid official channels. Remote, lots of inlets and coves. Properties that could be accessed by water without passing through town. Harold leaned forward with interest. What kind of transportation? People, mostly. Refugees, defectors, occasionally someone who needed to disappear for their own safety. Margaret's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. There were stories about safe houses, temporary stops along routes that led to Canada or other destinations. Elise felt her pulse quicken. Do you have any records of specific incidents? Missing persons cases from that era? Margaret nodded, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. I keep unofficial notes about things that don't make it into the official town history. Too controversial, you understand. But Michael Kowalski's disappearance was significant enough that people still remember it. She opened the ledger to a page marked with a faded ribbon. Michael Kowalski disappeared September 15, 1963. The official investigation concluded he'd likely drowned in a boating accident, though his body was never recovered. But there were aspects of the case that never made sense. Such as? Elise asked. His boat was found tied securely at the dock. No signs of distress or hasty departure. His wallet and keys were in his truck, but his work documents were missing from his home office. And Elena, his wife, she seemed to know more than she was telling. Margaret turned several pages, revealing newspaper clippings and handwritten notes. Elena disappeared about 18 months after Michael was declared dead. Left one day without telling anyone. Closed her bank accounts. Sold nothing, but took very little. Almost like she'd been planning it. Harold examined the wedding ring again, comparing the date to Margaret's records. The timeline fits. They were married in 1962. He disappeared in 1963. She left in 1965. But here's what's interesting. Margaret continued, pulling out a manila envelope. A few years ago, someone else came asking about the Kowalski case. A man in his 50s said he was researching Cold War history for a book. He spent hours going through these same records. Elise and Harold exchanged glances. Did he leave a name? Called himself David Brennan, but he paid in cash and didn't seem much like a historian. Asked very specific questions about property ownership around the lake during the 60s. Wanted to know about any buildings that might have been used for storage or safe houses. The implications were troubling. Someone else was investigating the same mystery, and their interest seemed more practical than academic. Do you remember what specific properties he asked about? Harold inquired. Margaret consulted her notes. The old Morrison place was mentioned several times. Also the Wickham farm. That's your family's property, isn't it, Harold? Harold's face darkened. Was. Sold it 15 years ago when I couldn't keep up with the maintenance. But during the 60s, we did have government folks approach us about using the barn for storage. Paid well, asked no questions, so we agreed. What kind of storage? Never knew for sure. They brought things in unmarked trucks, usually at night. My father was told it was agricultural research supplies, but the security seemed excessive for fertilizer experiments. As they pieced together the historical context, Elise began to see the outline of a larger operation, a network of properties around the lake used for moving people and materials through unofficial channels. Her parents had apparently been part of this network, though their exact roles remained unclear. "Margaret, do you have detailed maps of the lake from that period?" Elise asked. "Something that might help us identify specific coordinates?" Margaret produced a large rolled map, spreading it across the table. "This is from 1962. Shows all the properties and access roads around the lake." Harold studied the coordinates from Buddy's capsule, using a ruler to measure distances and angles. "If these numbers are accurate, they point to a spot on the north shore, near where Willow Creek feeds into the lake." "That's pretty remote," Margaret observed. "Nothing but woods and a few old hunting cabins in that area. Perfect place to hide something you didn't want found." Harold murmured "Dot." As they prepared to leave the Historical Society, Margaret pulled Elise aside. "My dear, I hope you're being careful. The man who was here asking questions, Mr. Brennan, he left me with the impression that this wasn't just academic curiosity. Some secrets from that era were buried for good reasons." Driving toward the coordinates that afternoon, Elise found herself studying the landscape with new eyes. Every isolated cabin, every boat launch, every dirt road leading into the woods could potentially have played a role in the clandestine activities Harold and Margaret had described. "There," Harold said, pointing to a barely visible path leading off the main road. "That track leads down to the creek. Haven't been back there in years, but I remember it being a good spot for fishing." The path was overgrown and rough, forcing them to park and continue on foot. As they walked through the dense woods, Elise noticed signs that others had passed this way, recently broken branches, footprints in the soft earth near the creek. The coordinates led them to a small clearing overlooking the water, where the remnants of an old stone foundation were barely visible beneath years of accumulated leaves and undergrowth. It might have been a hunting cabin once, or perhaps something more purposeful. Harold knelt beside the foundation, brushing away debris. "Look at this," he said, uncovering what appeared to be a metal container partially buried beneath one of the foundation stones. Inside the container, wrapped in oilcloth, they found more artifacts, additional photographs, documents in multiple languages, and what appeared to be currency from several different countries. But most significantly, there was a leather journal filled with entries in 2 different handwritings, one that Elise recognized as unmistakably her mother's. Dot, as she opened the journal and began reading the first entry, dated August 1963, Elise felt the last remaining pieces of her carefully constructed world beginning to shift. Her mother's words, written in the measured tone of someone documenting events for posterity, began to reveal a story far more complex and dangerous than anything she'd imagined. "Harold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think we're going to need more time to go through all of this. And I think we're going to need somewhere more secure to do it." That evening, Harold and Elise spread the contents of the hidden container across the floor of her apartment, each item carefully cataloged and photographed before examination. The bullet casing from Buddy's neck took on new significance as they uncovered additional ammunition and what appeared to be the remnants of a small handgun, its metal corroded by decades of burial. "This changes everything," Elise said, holding the weapon with careful fingers. "This isn't just about hiding information. Someone expected violence." Harold's face was grim as he examined the foreign currency. "These bills are from East Germany, Poland, and Russia, all from the early 1960s. Your parents weren't just translators, Elise. They were handling currency from behind the Iron Curtain." The journal entries painted an increasingly complex picture. Elena's handwriting documented meetings with individuals, identified only by code names, movements of people and materials across the Canadian border, and growing concerns about surveillance. But it was Michael's entries, written in a careful script that proved most revealing. August 20th, 1963, contact from Moscow confirms our extraction route has been compromised. Elena insists we continue the mission, but I fear we're being watched. By both sides now. The Americans suspect us of being double agents, while Moscow grows impatient with our reports. Elise looked up from the journal. Double agents? Harold, what were my parents involved in? From what I'm reading here, it sounds like they were caught in the middle of something much larger than either of them anticipated. Harold pointed to another entry. Look at this one from September 10th, 5 days before Michael disappeared. The handler they call Raven has gone silent. Elena received a coded message indicating immediate extraction may be necessary. We've prepared contingency plans, including the dispersal protocol for sensitive materials. If something happens to me, Elena has instructions to proceed with Identity 7. Identity 7, Elise repeated. That must be how she became Elena. Warren instead of Elena Kowalski. As they continued reading, a clearer picture emerged of a sophisticated intelligence operation that had grown dangerous for its participants. Michael and Elena had apparently been recruited by Soviet intelligence while living in Chicago, tasked with establishing a network for moving defectors and sensitive materials through the Great Lakes region. But something had gone wrong. The journal. Entries became increasingly paranoid, documenting suspicious vehicles, strange phone calls, and the growing sense that their cover was blown. September 14th, 1963 final entry. Michael had written, "They know. Elena will proceed with the extraction protocol tomorrow. I'll create enough noise to draw their attention while she disappears. The insurance packages have been prepared and distributed. If anyone finds these records, know that we served our conscience more than any country." Harold closed the journal carefully, so he sacrificed himself to let her escape. But why use Buddy? Why hide evidence in a dog that wouldn't be found for decades? Because, a voice said from the stairway leading to her apartment, they knew someone would eventually come looking for what they'd hidden. Elise spun around to see a man in his 50s standing at the top of her stairs, his presence both calm and somehow menacing. He was well-dressed, with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, but there was something in his eyes that made her reach instinctively for her phone. "Dr. Warren, Mr. Wickham," the man continued, stepping into the room with the confidence of someone who belonged there. "My name is David Brennan. I believe you've been expecting me." Harold's hand moved toward the corroded weapon they'd found. But Brennan shook his head with a slight smile. "Please don't. I'm not here to hurt anyone. I'm here because you've uncovered something that affects national security, even after all these decades." "How did you get in here?" Elise demanded, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The same way I've been monitoring your investigation since you first opened those capsules. Dr. Warren, your parents were part of an operation that officially never existed. Some aspects of that operation are still classified at the highest levels." Brennan moved closer, his eyes scanning the artifacts spread across the floor. "What you found represents only a small portion of what Michael and Elena Kowalski were involved in. There are people on both sides of what used to be the Iron Curtain who would kill to get their hands on this information." "Then why haven't you stopped us?" Harold asked, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "Because Elena Kowalski, your mother, was smarter than any of us realized at the time. She didn't just disappear. She created an insurance policy, a dead man switch that would expose the entire network if anything happened to her or her family." Elise felt a chill run down her spine. "What kind of insurance policy?" "The kind that keeps certain secrets buried and certain people alive," Brennan replied. "Your mother has been watching over you for 30 years, Dr. Warren, making sure you stayed safe, stayed unaware, stayed out of the game she and your father played." He paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. But now that you've found this cache, that protection may not be enough. There are parties who will see your knowledge as either a threat to be eliminated or an asset to be acquired. As if to punctuate his warning, the sound of car doors slamming came from the street below. Brennan's expression tightened as he moved to the window. "We need to leave," he said urgently. "Now, and you need to bring everything you found." "Why? Should we trust you?" Elise asked, even as she began gathering the artifacts. "Because," Brennan said, already heading for the back stairs, "your mother asked me to keep you safe if this day ever came. And that day is today." The escape from Elise's apartment happened with a surreal efficiency that suggested Brennan had planned for this possibility. As they slipped down the back stairs, Elise could hear voices and footsteps in the alley behind her building. People who clearly weren't there for a social visit. "My car is 2 blocks away," Brennan whispered as they emerged onto a side street. "Stay close and try to look casual." Harold carried the container of artifacts while Elise clutched the journal and her medical bag, her mind racing with questions she didn't have time to ask. As they walked quickly through the quiet streets of Millbrook, she noticed details she'd never paid attention to before. Which windows offered good sightlines, which alleys provided escape routes, which cars seemed out of place for a small lakeside town. "Where are we going?" she asked as they reached Brennan's sedan, a nondescript vehicle that could have belonged to any middle-aged professional. "Somewhere we can decode the message your father left in that rice paper," Brennan replied, starting the engine. "The coordinates you found were just the beginning." Michael Kowalski was thorough. He created multiple caches around the lake, each one containing pieces of a larger puzzle. As they drove through the darkness, Brennan began to fill in the gaps that the journal entries had left unclear. Michael and Elena Kowalski had been recruited by Soviet intelligence in 1961, but their loyalty had never been as straightforward as their handlers believed. They were idealists, Brennan explained. Immigrants who believed they could help prevent nuclear war by facilitating communication between East and West. But they were also Americans who loved this country, which put them in an impossible position. Harold studied the coded message they'd found with the foreign currency. The rice paper was covered with numbers and symbols that appeared random, but clearly followed some kind of pattern. "Your father was trained in cryptography," Brennan continued. "This looks like a book cipher. The numbers refer to specific pages, lines, and words in a reference text." "What kind of reference text?" Elise asked. "Something both sides would have access to. Something common enough not to arouse suspicion." Brennan pulled off the main road onto a dirt track that led toward the lake. Given the time period and their background, probably a Bible or a classic work of literature, the safe house Brennan led them to was a modest fishing cabin that looked abandoned from the outside, but proved to be well-maintained and equipped with modern communication equipment. As he unlocked the door, Elise realized this man had been planning for this encounter for a very long time. "Harold, you mentioned that government people used your family's barn for storage in the 60s, Brennan said as he activated what appeared to be a sophisticated security system. "Do you remember any books or documents they might have left behind?" Harold thought for a moment. "My father kept a few things in the house after they cleared out, said. They were just reference materials that weren't worth moving. There was a Bible, some technical manuals, a few novels." "We need to get those books," Brennan said urgently. If Michael used a book cipher, he would have chosen something he knew Elena could access if she ever needed to decode his messages. While Brennan set up encryption equipment to communicate with his contacts, Elise studied her mother's journal entries more carefully. Elena's later writings revealed a growing sophistication in tradecraft and a deep understanding of the dangerous game they were playing. January 1964, Michael's sacrifice bought me time to establish Identity 7, but I know they're still looking. I've hidden the final protocols in places only our daughter will think to search when the time comes. She will need the truth someday, but only when she's strong enough to handle the consequences. The reference to hidden protocols sent a chill through Elise. Her mother had been planning for this day since before Elise was even old enough to understand what secrets were. "Brennan, you said my mother asked you to protect me. When? How?" Your mother never fully trusted anyone, but she needed someone on the American side who could watch over you if the situation changed. Brennan looked up from his equipment. "She contacted me in 1987 when you were starting college. Made me promise that if you ever stumbled onto the truth about your parents, I'd make sure you had the full story before anyone else could manipulate you." Harold returned from his family's old property with a small collection of books, including a well-worn Bible with margin notes in multiple languages. As they applied the numbers from the rice paper to biblical passages, a longer message began to emerge. The northern route remains compromised, but southern passage through Wickham property still secure. The decoded message read, "Final insurance stored at location 7 coordinates in Elena's possession. Trust only those who know the story of the wooden bird." The wooden bird? Elise looked at both men questioningly. Harold's face showed sudden recognition. There was a carved loon in the barn where they stored their materials. Russian workmanship, beautifully detailed. "My father kept it after they left, said it was the only pretty thing they'd left behind." "That's the authentication key," Brennan said with satisfaction. Anyone who knew about the wooden bird was part of the inner circle, someone your parents trusted with their lives. As they worked through the night to decode additional messages, a complex picture emerged of a network that had extended far beyond simple intelligence gathering. Michael and Elena had been facilitating the movement of scientists, artists, and dissidents who wanted to defect from the Soviet Union, while also passing carefully selected information to American intelligence agencies. But they'd been betrayed by someone within their own network, someone who'd sold information to hostile parties on both sides of the Cold War. "That's why the extraction went wrong," Brennan explained. "Someone wanted both Michael and Elena eliminated, they knew too. Much about operations that certain people preferred to keep hidden." "And now?" Elise asked. "Now, those same people are old, powerful, and desperate to make sure their secrets die with them," Brennan replied grimly. "Your investigation has stirred up a hornet's nest that's been dormant for 30 years. As dawn approached, Elise found herself facing a choice that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She could walk away, return to her quiet veterinary practice, and let the past remain buried. Or she could continue following the trail her parents had left, knowing it would likely destroy the peaceful life she'd built, but might finally give her the truth about who she really was. Looking at her mother's journal one more time, at the careful handwriting that had documented such dangerous secrets, Elise knew her choice had already been made. Some truths were worth any price, even the price of safety. The final cache was located exactly where the decoded coordinates indicated beneath, a false floor in the abandoned Morrison Properties root cellar. As they descended into the musty darkness, Elise's flashlight revealed not just another metal container, but an entire room that had been converted into a document storage facility. "Dear God," Harold whispered, surveying the shelves lined with files, photographs, and recording equipment that looked decades old, but remarkably well-preserved. Brennan moved with the efficiency of someone familiar with intelligence archives, quickly identifying the most significant materials. "Your parents were more thorough than anyone realized. This isn't just evidence of their operations. It's a complete record of the entire network." But it was Elise who found the container that changed everything. Hidden behind a false panel, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture and time, was a leather portfolio containing documents that made her hands tremble as she read them. "Brennan," she said, her voice barely steady, "I need you to look at this." The first document was a birth certificate not hers. but one issued in Moscow in 1961 for a child named Yelena Mikhailovna Volkova. The parents were listed as Mikhail Volkov and Marina Alexeyevna Volkova. "That's not possible," she said, though the evidence was literally in her hands. "My parents were Michael and Elena Kowalski, Polish immigrants." Brennan examined the documents carefully, his expression growing increasingly troubled. "Elise, I think you need to sit down." Additional papers revealed the truth in meticulous detail. Mikhail Volkov and Marina Volkova had been deep-cover Soviet operatives embedded in American society with carefully constructed identities as Michael and Elena Kowalski. They had been married in Moscow, trained extensively in American customs and language, then inserted into the United States as part of a long-term intelligence operation. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Among the documents was a medical record showing that Marina Volkova had given birth to a daughter in Moscow before their deployment to America. The child had been left in the care of Soviet relatives while her parents established their American identities. Elise stared at the birth certificate, seeing her own features reflected in a photograph attached to immigration documents from 1963. "This says I was born in Moscow, that I lived there until I was 2 years old. Your parents brought you to America when they realized their mission was compromised," Brennan said gently. "Elena Marina couldn't bear to leave you behind when they fled." Harold was examining other documents from the cache, his face growing pale as he read. "Elise, there's more. Your mother didn't die in that car accident in 1998. The file Harold had found contained surveillance photographs dated as recently as 2020, showing an older woman with unmistakably familiar features living in what appeared to be a rural Canadian setting. Notes in the margin indicated she had been living under the name Anna Petrov, working as a translator for the Canadian government. "She's alive," Elise whispered, the words carrying a weight of shock and betrayal that threatened to overwhelm her. "My mother is alive, and she's been letting me think she was dead for over 20 years. Brennan's expression was sympathetic but unsurprised. The car accident was staged. Elena Marina needed to disappear completely after some of their old enemies started surfacing in the post-Cold War chaos. She thought you'd be safer believing she was gone." "Safer?" Elise's voice rose with anger and hurt. "I spent 20 years thinking I was alone in the world, wondering if I'd somehow failed her, failed to be the daughter she needed." "You need to understand the context," Brennan interrupted gently. In 1998, several former Soviet operatives were being assassinated by parties unknown. Marina had reason to believe that you were both targets. The only way to protect you was to make everyone believe she was dead while she drew their attention away from you. The implications of these revelations cascaded through Elise's understanding of her entire life. Her careful retreat to Millbrook, her avoidance of deep relationships, her instinctive wariness of authority figures, all of it suddenly made sense as inherited survival instincts rather than personal neuroses. "Where is she now?" Elise asked, studying the surveillance photographs. "According to our most recent intelligence, she's living in a small town outside Vancouver, still translating, still watching over you from a distance." Brennan paused, seeming to weigh his next words carefully. "She's been waiting for this day, Elise, waiting for you to find the truth and decide what to do with it." Harold had continued exploring the cache and found something that made him call out urgently. "You both need to see this." He was holding a reel-to-reel tape recorder and several tape reels, labeled with dates from 1963. There are audio recordings here, conversations, meetings, something called Insurance Protocol Final. As Brennan set up the old equipment, Elise tried to process the magnitude of what she'd learned. Her entire identity American citizen, daughter of immigrants, orphaned young woman making her own way in the world had been built on lies. But they were lies told by people who loved her, who had sacrificed everything to keep her safe. Tape crackled to life with her father's voice, speaking in accented English that revealed his true origins. If you are hearing this, then our fears have been realized and the network has been compromised. Marina and I came to America as agents of the Soviet Union, but we became Americans in our hearts. We served our conscience more than any country. Her mother's voice joined the recording. Our daughter must know the truth, but only when she is old enough to handle the responsibility that comes with it. We have left evidence that will protect her and expose those who betrayed the network, but she must choose whether to use it. The recording continued with detailed explanations of the intelligence operation, the names of other agents, and most crucially, the identity of the person who had betrayed them to hostile parties on both sides of the Cold War. Senator James Morrison, her father's voice said with obvious disgust. He was supposed to be our American handler, but he was selling information to the highest bidder. When we discovered his betrayal, we became liabilities to be eliminated. Elise looked at Brennan with new understanding. The Morrison property, where we found these documents, belonged to his family. Yes, it wasn't coincidence that Michael chose to hide evidence there. He wanted to make sure anyone who found it would understand exactly who was responsible for the betrayal. The final part of the recording was addressed directly to her. Yelena Elise, if you are hearing this, know that everything we did was to give you the freedom to choose your own path. You are both Russian and American, the daughter of spies, and the child of people who learned to love their adopted country more than their birth nation. What you do with this knowledge is your choice alone. As the tape ended, Elise sat in the dusty silence of the hidden room, surrounded by the artifacts of her parents' extraordinary lives. She understood now why her mother had chosen to disappear, why the charade of death had been necessary, and why the truth had been hidden until she was strong enough to bear it. But she also understood that the revelation brought with it a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could continue living as Elena Warren, small-town veterinarian, safe in her anonymity. Or she could reclaim her heritage as Yelena Volkova, daughter of spies, and face whatever consequences came with that truth. Looking at the photograph of her mother alive, older, but unmistakably the woman who had raised her, Elise realized her choice had already been made. The revelation that Marina Volkova was alive and living in Canada created an urgency that none of them had anticipated. As they packed the most crucial documents from the hidden cache, Brennan explained the delicate situation they now faced. The moment we make contact with your mother will be visible to intelligence agencies on both sides of the border, he said, carefully wrapping the audio recordings. There are people who have spent 30 years believing this operation was fully buried. Your mother's survival, combined with the evidence you've uncovered, represents a threat they can't ignore. Elise found herself caught between desperate need and paralyzing fear. The woman she'd mourned for over 20 years was alive, had been watching over her from afar, had orchestrated this entire discovery through a rescue dog that had somehow found its way to her clinic. But reaching out to Marina meant abandoning the safe, predictable life she'd built in Millbrook. There's something else you need to understand, Brennan continued as they loaded the artifacts into his car. Your mother didn't just disappear. She's been actively working to protect other former operatives who were caught in similar situations. She's built a network of people who help individuals trapped by their Cold War past. Harold, who had been unusually quiet during the revelations in the cache, finally spoke up. Dr. Warren Elise, I need to tell you something I should have said earlier. The gravity in his voice made both Elise and Brennan stop their preparations. I wasn't just a young Coast Guard officer during the 60s. I was recruited by American intelligence to monitor the activities around the lake. Harold's weathered hand shook slightly as he continued. I knew your parents, knew what they were doing, and I helped them when their extraction went wrong. Elise stared at him, trying to process yet another revelation that reframed everything she thought she understood. I was the one who helped Marina fake her death in 1998, Harold admitted. She contacted me when she learned that Senator Morrison was planning to eliminate loose ends from the old operation. I helped create the car accident, helped her disappear across the border. And you've been watching me all these years? From a distance, yes. Making sure you were safe, making sure no one was asking the wrong questions about Dr. Elena Warren's daughter. Harold's voice carried the weight of decades of secrets. When Buddy showed up near the old Morrison property, I knew it wasn't coincidence. Marina had told me that if anything happened to activate the emergency protocols, the evidence would find its way to you through channels you couldn't ignore. Brennan nodded approvingly. Your mother always was the most thorough operative I ever worked with. She knew that eventually, either the secrets would surface or you would need the protection they provided. Buddy was her insurance policy, a way to make sure you found the truth when you were ready for it. As they drove toward the Canadian border, Elise read the final letter her mother had hidden in the cache. Written in Marina's careful handwriting, it carried a date from just 6 months earlier. My dearest Yelena, the letter began, using the Russian name that Elise had never heard spoken aloud but somehow recognized as belonging to her. If you are reading this, then the protocols I established have been activated, and you have learned the truth about your heritage. I know this knowledge brings pain along with understanding, and I am sorry for the deception that has shaped your life. The letter went on to explain Marina's reasoning for the staged death, her ongoing work helping other former operatives, and her constant monitoring of Elise's life from afar. I have watched you become a healer, someone who dedicates her life to caring for creatures that cannot speak for themselves. This tells me that despite the shadows of your parentage, you have grown into someone guided by compassion rather than ideology. I am proud of the woman you have become, even if I cannot claim credit for raising her. The most significant revelation came in the letter's final paragraphs. The network that your father and I served has evolved over the decades. There are still people on both sides who need help escaping the consequences of choices they made during the Cold War. If you choose to contact me, know that you will be welcomed not just as my daughter, but as someone who might help others find the safety we have found. She wants me to join her work, Elise said, looking up from the letter as they approached the border crossing. She wants you to have the choice, Brennan corrected. Something neither she nor your father ever really had. The border crossing proved more complicated than anticipated. While Brennan's credentials allowed him to pass with minimal scrutiny, both Elise and Harold were subjected to additional questioning that suggested someone had flagged their travel. Are you visiting Canada for business or pleasure? The border agent asked Elise, studying her passport with unusual attention. Visiting family, she replied, which was technically true even if the circumstances were extraordinary. As they finally crossed into Canadian territory, Brennan's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made his expression tighten with concern. What is it? Elise asked. Your clinic was searched last night. Professional job, no obvious damage, but someone went through everything very thoroughly. Brennan accelerated slightly as he delivered the news. They're looking for any evidence you might have kept, which means they know you found something significant. The implications were chilling. Returning to her quiet life in Millbrook was no longer an option. Too many people now knew that Elise Warren had uncovered secrets that were supposed to stay buried. How much farther to where my mother is living? She asked. 2 hours if we stick to back roads and avoid the main highways. But Elise, you need to understand that once you make contact with her, there's no going back to anonymity. The people looking for this information will know exactly who you are and what you represent. As they drove through the Canadian countryside, Elise found herself studying her reflection in the passenger side mirror, looking for traces of the Russian features she'd apparently inherited. The woman looking back at her was still recognizably the veterinarian from Millbrook, but there was something different in her eyes, a hardness that came from learning, uncomfortable truths about the world and her place in it. Harold, sitting in the back seat with the container of artifacts, spoke quietly. "Your mother made me promise to give you something when this day came." He pulled out a small wooden carving, the loon that had been mentioned in the coded messages. "She said it would help you understand that some of the most important things in life are worth protecting, even if it means sacrificing other things we value." The carving was exquisite, clearly the work of a master craftsman. As Elise turned it over in her hands, she noticed that the base could be removed, revealing a small hollow space containing a key and an address. "A safe house," Brennan identified, glancing at the address. "Your mother prepared for the possibility that you might need somewhere secure to meet." The key felt warm in Elise's palm, as if it had been waiting years for her to claim it. As they turned onto the rural road that would take them to Marina Volkova, the woman she had known as Elise Warren, the mother she had mourned as dead, Elise tried to prepare herself for a reunion that would redefine everything she thought she knew about love, loss, and the lengths parents would go to protect their children. "Are you ready for this?" Harold asked gently. Elise looked at the wooden loon, at the key that would unlock not just a door, but an entirely new understanding of her life, and at the landscape that would soon reveal the woman who had shaped their destiny from the shadows. "I don't think anyone could be ready for this," she replied, "but I need to see her. I need to understand why she chose to let me believe she was dead rather than trust me with the truth." And then Brennan asked Elise thought of her quiet clinic, her patients who depended on her, the peaceful life she'd built in Millbrook. All of it seemed distant now, as if it belonged to someone else, someone who had never learned she was the daughter of Soviet spies, someone who had never discovered that love sometimes required the ultimate deception. "Then I'll decide who I want to be," she said. "Elise Warren or Yelena Volkova, the veterinarian or the spy's daughter, the woman who hides from the truth or the one who faces it." As they approached the address on the key, Elise realized that the choice between her two identities might not be as clear-cut as she'd imagined. Perhaps the real challenge would be learning to be both. The safe house was a modest cabin overlooking a pristine lake that reminded Elise painfully of Millbrook. As Brennan's car pulled into the gravel driveway, she saw movement behind the curtained windows, someone who had been watching for their arrival. The door opened before they could knock, and Elise found herself face to face with Marina Volkova. Her mother was older, her dark hair now silver, her face lined with the weight of years spent looking over her shoulder. But her eyes were unmistakably the same, intelligent, cautious, and filled with a love that had never wavered despite decades of separation. "Yelena," Marina said softly, the Russian pronunciation of her name carrying emotional weight that the English version had never held. For a moment, neither woman moved. 23 years of grief, anger, and questions hung in the air between them. Then Marina stepped forward and pulled her daughter into an embrace that felt both foreign and completely natural. "I'm so sorry," Marina whispered in accented English that Elise now understood was carefully controlled rather than imperfect. "I'm so sorry for all of it." As they separated, Elise saw that her mother was crying, the first time she'd ever seen such vulnerability from the woman who had seemed unshakable during her childhood. "You let me think you were dead," Elise said, her voice carrying hurt that had festered for over 2 decades. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "Every day," Marina replied. "Every single day, I weighed your safety against your emotional well-being, and every day I chose to keep you safe." Harold and Brennan had tactfully withdrawn to give them privacy, but Elise could sense their presence as a protective barrier against the outside world. Inside the cabin, she noticed details that spoke to her mother's true nature books in multiple languages, maps marked with locations she didn't recognize, and photographs of people who looked like they carried their own burdens of secrets. "Tell me about Buddy," Elise said, settling into a chair across from Marina. "Tell me how a rescue dog ended up carrying the key to my entire identity." Marina's smile was tinged with sadness and pride. "Your father was always thorough in his contingency planning. Before his sacrifice, he created multiple insurance policies, ways to ensure that if something happened to both of us, you would eventually learn the truth when you were strong enough to handle it." She moved to a desk and withdrew a leather portfolio similar to the one they'd found in the cache. "Buddy was part of the final protocol. If I ever activated it, he would be released near your location with evidence that would lead you through a specific discovery process. I chose to activate it 6 months ago when I learned that certain parties were beginning to ask questions about Dr. Elise Warren." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggested your cover might be compromised. There are people, former colleagues, government officials, private contractors who profit from keeping Cold War secrets buried. When I heard that someone was researching veterinarians in small towns who might have family connections to intelligence operations, I knew it was time." Marina opened the portfolio and showed Elise a locket silver, intricately engraved, containing a tiny photograph of Elise as a baby. "I've carried this every day since I had to leave you." "Physical proof of what?" "I sacrificed to keep you safe." The sight of the locket, clearly worn smooth by decades of handling, broke through Elise's emotional defenses in a way that words couldn't. This wasn't the calculated manipulation of a trained operative. It was the desperate love of a mother who had given up everything to protect her child. "I watched you grow up from a distance," Marina continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "I knew when you graduated veterinary school, when you moved to Millbrook, when you saved that family of puppies from the flooding 3 years ago. I've been proud of you every single day, even though I couldn't tell you." "Why now?" Elise asked. "Why activate the protocol after all these years?" Marina's expression darkened. "Because Senator Morrison's son is running for governor, and he's been systematically eliminating anyone who might have evidence of his father's Cold War activities. 3 former operatives have died in the past year, all ruled accidents. All people who knew about James Morrison's betrayals." The revelation sent a chill through Elise. "He knows about me. He knows about Elena Warren's daughter. But until now, he didn't know that Elena Warren was Marina Volkova, or that her daughter had access to evidence that could destroy his family's political legacy." Brennan appeared in the doorway, his expression urgent. "We have a problem." 2 vehicles just turned onto the Access Road government plates, moving fast. Marina was already in motion, gathering documents and moving toward what appeared to be a hidden exit at the back of the cabin. "The protocols include extraction procedures. We can be across the border within an hour if we leave now." But Elise found herself hesitating. "What about Harold? What about the people I care about in Millbrook? They'll be safer if you're not there," Marina said firmly. "The longer you stay in one place, the more danger you bring to everyone around you." As the sound of car doors slamming echoed from the front of the cabin, Elise realized that her choice between her 2 identities was being made for her. The safe, predictable life of Dr. Elise Warren was ending whether she was ready or not. "Come with me," Marina said, extending her hand. "I can teach you to survive in this world, help you use the skills you inherited to protect others, the way your father and I tried to do." Through the back window, Elise could see Harold and Brennan creating a diversion, drawing the attention of the approaching agents. These men who had helped her uncover the truth were now sacrificing their own safety to give her and Marina a chance to escape. "What if I don't want this life?" Elise asked, even as she moved toward the hidden exit. "Then we'll find a way to get you back to the life you want," Marina replied. "But right now, survival has to come first." As they slipped through the back door and into the woods behind the cabin, Elise heard voices from inside official, demanding, dangerous. The childhood games of hide and seek she'd played with her mother took on new significance as Marina led her through the trees with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent decades evading capture. The locket bounced against Marina's chest as they moved, catching occasional glimpses of sunlight filtering through the trees. Physical proof of a mother's love, carried through years of exile and sacrifice. As they reached the hidden boat that would carry them to safety, Elise understood that some bonds transcended even the most elaborate deceptions. Her mother had let her believe she was dead not out of abandonment, but out of a love so profound that she was willing to live with that pain every day if it meant keeping her daughter safe. Now, as they prepared to disappear together into a world of shadows and secrets, Elise realized that understanding her mother's sacrifice was only the beginning of learning who she herself was meant to be. The boat carried them across the lake in the gray pre-dawn light, its electric motor nearly silent as Marina navigated between small islands that provided cover from any surveillance. Elise found herself studying her mother's movements, the way she checked their surroundings constantly, the practiced efficiency with which she handled the boat, the calm competence that came from years of living on the edge of danger. "Where are we going?" Elise asked, keeping her voice low despite the distance they put between themselves and the cabin. "There's a network," Marina replied, adjusting their course toward what appeared to be an uninhabited shoreline. "People like us, caught between their past and their present, who help each other stay hidden and stay safe." As they approached a seemingly deserted dock, Elise noticed movement in the trees, people who had been waiting for their arrival. An elderly man emerged from the shadows, his bearing suggesting military training, followed by a younger woman whose eyes held the particular wariness of someone who understood the cost of survival. "These are my friends," Marina said as she secured the boat. Thomas was CIA during the 70s, betrayed by his own agency when politics changed. Anna was a translator like your father, caught in the middle when her handlers decided she knew too much. The introductions were brief but meaningful. Each person's story contained echoes of her parents' experience, the common thread of individuals who had served their countries faithfully only to find themselves expendable when circumstances changed. "The evidence you found," Thomas said without preamble. "It's enough to bring down Morrison's son and expose the network that's been eliminating witnesses. But only if we can get it to the right people," Anna added. "There are journalists, investigators, people who've been waiting years for proof of what really happened during those operations." Marina produced a secure phone and began making encrypted calls. Her conversations brief and coded in ways that reminded Elise of the complexity of the world her parents had navigated. As she listened, she began to understand that her choice wasn't simply between hiding and exposure. There was a third option. "You want me to go public," Elise said when Marina finished her calls. "Use my story to protect the others." "I want you to understand your options," Marina corrected. "You have evidence that could save lives and expose corruption that's lasted for decades. But using it means giving up any chance of returning to anonymity." The weight of the decision pressed down on Elise as she considered what each choice would mean. Remaining hidden meant safety, but also meant allowing the pattern of elimination to continue. Going public meant protection through visibility, but also meant living forever as a target. "What about Harold and Brennan?" she asked. "Safe," Thomas reported, checking his own secure communications. Brennan's credentials protected him from anything more than questioning, and Harold's age and reputation made the agents reluctant to push too hard. But they're both under surveillance now. As the morning sun rose over the lake, Elise found herself thinking about the animals she'd left behind in Millbrook, patients who depended on her, cases that needed follow-up, a community that had trusted her with their most precious companions. The life she'd built seemed both distant and impossibly precious. "I need guarantees," she said finally. "If I do this, If I testify and provide the evidence, I need to know that the people I care about will be protected." Marina's expression showed pride and concern in equal measure. "Your father would be proud of you for thinking of others first. Yes, protections can be arranged. New identities if necessary, relocation assistance, ongoing security." Anna nodded approvingly. "The network takes care of its own, always." "And after?" Elise asked. "After the testimony and the trials and the media coverage, what then?" "Then you choose who you want to be," Marina said, echoing the words Elise had spoken in the car. Elise Warren, Yelena Volkova, or someone entirely new. "The evidence your father left behind includes financial resources, identity documents, everything you'd need to start over anywhere in the world." As they prepared to leave the safe house and begin the process of turning evidence over to authorities, Marina handed Elise the complete intelligence file, her parents' full record of operations, betrayals, and sacrifices. "This tells the whole story," Marina said. "Not just about your father and me, but about dozens of people who served their countries with honor and were abandoned when politics made them inconvenient." Elise held the file, feeling the weight of all the lives it represented. Her decision would affect not just her own future, but the fate of people she'd never met who were counting on someone being brave enough to tell the truth. "I'll do it," she said quietly. "I'll testify." Marina's smile was radiant with relief and pride. "Your father always said you had his courage and my stubbornness. I think he would be very proud of the woman you've become." As they prepared to emerge from the shadows and face whatever consequences came with the truth, Elise realized that she was no longer choosing between her identities. She was integrating them into someone stronger than either could be alone. 6 months after the testimony that had dominated international headlines for weeks, Dr. Elise Warren walked through the doors of her veterinary clinic in Millbrook, carrying a small carrier containing her newest patient, a young German shepherd puppy with bright, intelligent eyes and a collar tag that read, "Hope." The clinic looked exactly as she'd left it, though Sarah had kept everything running smoothly during her extended absence. The community had welcomed her back with the particular kind of discretion that small towns reserved for their own. They knew something significant had happened, but they respected her privacy enough not to pry. "Dr. Warren," Sarah called from the examination room, her voice carrying genuine joy. "Mrs. Henderson called 3 times this morning. Whiskers is stuck in another tree, and she specifically requested that you handle the rescue personally." Elise smiled, feeling a warmth that had been absent during the complicated months of debriefings, testimony, and media attention. "Some things never change. Schedule her for this afternoon." The trials had concluded with convictions that would reshape how intelligence operations were overseen and how former operatives were treated. Morrison's son had withdrawn from the gubernatorial race, and several other officials had resigned, rather than face investigation. Most importantly, the network of former operatives who had lived in fear for decades now had legal protections and support services. Marina had been offered full rehabilitation and recognition for her service. But she'd chosen to remain in Canada, continuing her work, helping others navigate the complex aftermath of intelligence operations. She visited regularly, and their relationship had evolved into something neither of them had expected, not the mother-daughter bond of Elise's childhood, but a friendship between 2 women who understood each other's choices and respected each other's strength. Harold stopped by the clinic most afternoons, officially to check on the animals he continued to rescue, but really to ensure that Elise was adjusting well to her return to normal life. His role in the network had been officially acknowledged, and he'd been offered recognition for his decades of quiet service. But he declined public attention in favor of continuing his work with abandoned animals. "He's been looking forward to meeting you," Harold said, nodding toward the puppy carrier as he settled into his usual chair in Elise's office. "Buddy's doing well with his new family," Elise reported, opening the carrier to let Hope explore the office. "The Hendersons say he's the gentlest dog they've ever had, and he seems to have completely recovered from his ordeal." "Animals are resilient," Harold observed, watching Hope investigate a rubber ball with the determined focus of the very young. "They don't carry grudges about the past. They just adapt to whatever situation they find themselves in and make the best of it." Elise nodded, thinking about her own process of adaptation. The revelation of her true parentage had been traumatic, but it had also provided answers to questions that had haunted her entire adult life. Understanding why her mother had been so protective, why she'd always seemed to be watching for something, why she'd taught Elise to be self-sufficient from such an early age, all of it finally made sense. "Any word from Brennan?" Harold asked. "He's been reassigned to a position where his expertise with Cold War cases will be valuable for helping other people in similar situations," Elise replied. "He sends updates occasionally, mostly about former operatives who've been successfully relocated or provided with new identities." The integration of her two identities, Elise Warren and Yelena Volkova, had been surprisingly natural. She'd kept her American name and her veterinary practice, but she'd also begun studying Russian and reconnecting with aspects of her cultural heritage that had been hidden throughout her childhood. The languages her parents had spoken in private. Conversations now made sense, and she'd found herself remembering fragments of lullabies Marina had sung in Russian when she was very small. "Dr. Warren?" Sarah appeared in the doorway. "Your 4 o'clock appointment is here. The new family with the rescue cat." As Elise prepared to meet her next patients, she reflected on how much had changed while everything important remained the same. She was still a veterinarian who found purpose in healing animals. She still lived in Millbrook, still found peace in the view of the lake from her office window. But now she understood that her calling to help vulnerable creatures came from more than just professional training. It was inherited instinct to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Hope had settled beside her desk, already showing the confident adaptability that would serve her well in life. Like Buddy before her, she'd found her way to someone who would understand her needs and help her thrive despite whatever hardships she'd experienced before. "Some stories," Elise said to Harold as she prepared to see her next patient, "have endings that are actually beginnings." Harold smiled, his weathered face creasing with satisfaction. "Your parents would be proud of how their story ended, with their daughter choosing courage over safety, truth over comfort, and service over self-preservation." As Elise walked into the examination room to meet the family with their rescue cat, she carried with her the integrated wisdom of two cultures, the strength that came from surviving difficult truths, and the peace that came from finally understanding her place in the world. Outside her window, the lake sparkled in the afternoon sun, its surface reflecting both the sky above and the depths below. A perfect metaphor for a life that had learned to embrace complexity without losing sight of what truly mattered. Hope followed at her heels, tail wagging, ready for whatever adventures lay ahead. Some rescues, Elise had learned, rescued the rescuer in return. And sometimes the most important journeys led not to somewhere new, but to a deeper understanding of home.